Hello everyone, before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. There are stories whispered in the shadows of America's forgotten valleys, tales so grotesque that even the families involved tried to erase them from memory. And yet, despite every attempt to bury the truth, fragments of these lives surface like bones rising through the soil. Tonight's story is one such tale, a man who blurred every moral line, who defied nature itself, and in doing so became a figure whispered about with horror for generations. They say he did the unthinkable, they say he fathered his own grandchild, they say he made his daughter pregnant. When I first stumbled across the records, it didn't read like history. It felt more like a curse. A small, dying town tucked away in the mountains, where the houses leaned inward like conspirators, and where neighbors spoke in half-truths. Nobody mentioned his name openly. Instead, they called him the father who never stopped being a father. It was a phrase laced with disgust, a grim acknowledgement of what everyone knew but dared not say aloud. The newspapers of the time avoided it. The church tried to disguise it. But the whispers outlived them all. A daughter, young and silenced by shame, was trapped under the weight of a man who believed his bloodline was not just a legacy, but a possession. He saw her not as a child, not as his own flesh and blood, but as an extension of himself, and in that twisted vision, the unholy bond was sealed. Even now, walking through the remnants of that town, you feel the silence pressing in. Broken fences, hollow-eyed houses, and in the center of it all, the memory of a family that imploded under its own darkness. The daughter's face rarely appears in photographs. When it does, her expression is always downcast, eyes turned away as though refusing to be seen. Perhaps she knew. Perhaps she was trying to tell us something, even then. And yet, the story persisted. Because secrets like these cannot stay hidden forever, they crawl back piece by piece until all that's left is a portrait of horror painted in blood and silence. What makes this story so disturbing is not just the act itself, but the environment that allowed it to happen. You see, families like his did not exist in isolation. They were products of places where time itself seemed to rot, where poverty and secrecy wrapped themselves around entire communities like a noose. In towns like this, people rarely left, and outsiders rarely came in. Generations lived and died within the same few miles of dirt road, and with each passing decade, the walls of silence grew higher. For this man, the father who became something far worse, the silence was protection. He was never challenged. His daughter's cries never left the four wooden walls of their collapsing home, and when rumors began to circulate, they were quickly swallowed by the town's instinct to look away. Because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging how deep the sickness had spread, and how complicit everyone had become in their refusal to act. The girl, his daughter, lived a life that was not her own. Accounts from neighbors describe her as timid, moving like a shadow, avoiding the gaze of anyone who might look too closely. She had no friends, no escape, no future that wasn't already chained to the will of the man who raised her. And then, one year, her body began to change. She carried the weight of a child that should never have existed, the grotesque offspring of a father's obsession with his own blood. Whispers turned into uneasy stares. People noticed, of course they did. But no one stepped forward. No sheriff's visit, no church inquiry, no neighbor knocking on the door. Just silence. And the silence was deafening. It was as if the whole town had entered into a pact of cowardice. Better to bury the shame than confront the monster living among them. And when the baby came, it was described by those few who dared to speak as frail, pale, and fragile. Some say it didn't live long. Others claim it did, and that the child became yet another part of this cursed lineage. Either way, the birth was not just the arrival of new life. It was the final proof of corruption so profound it defied comprehension. The father had crossed the ultimate boundary, and in doing so, he carved his name into a darker chapter of history, one that polite society will never willingly retell. To understand the father's descent, you have to understand the world he came from. He was not an accident, not a lone monster born out of nowhere. He was the product of a lineage already poisoned by isolation and secrecy. His parents were kin, as were their parents before them. Each generation folded in upon itself until bloodlines became tangled webs of repetition. Names reappeared on family records like echoes. Faces bore the unmistakable features of too much sameness: narrow jaws, crossed eyes, stunted growth. The body itself had become a record of choices made in silence. He grew up in a household where shame was never spoken of because it was stitched into daily life. Children worked the land with sunken eyes and brittle frames. Women rarely looked outsiders in the eye, as though fearing that a stranger might see through the veil, and men like him, were raised with an unspoken belief that the family was the world and the world outside did not matter. This belief, when twisted far enough, gave him justification. To him, his daughter was not his child, she was his possession, another branch of the tree he believed he alone could prune. When his wife died young, the girl became his only companion. Isolation deepened the rot. He withdrew from the sparse gatherings in town, showing up less at church, speaking even less to neighbors. The house became a fortress of secrecy, its windows shuttered, its doors barely opening to the world beyond. Inside, the father's grip on reality began to slip. He told himself stories of blood purity, of keeping the family whole, and in those twisted narratives, the horror began. The townspeople who later recounted fragments of the tale always returned to one thing: the girl's silence. She never cried out, never rebelled, never sought help. Some argued she was too terrified. Others believed she had been conditioned since childhood, taught that obedience was survival, and survival meant silence. And so the cycle continued. What should have been impossible became inevitable. A father stood where no man should ever stand. A daughter endured what no child should ever endure, and when the truth began to seep out, carried in hushed voices, the town recoiled, not because they didn't believe it, but because they did. It was easier to pretend the house at the edge of the valley didn't exist, easier to let shadows consume the truth than to face the sickness growing in their midst. What happened behind those closed doors left scars that no one could see, but everyone could feel. The daughter carried her father's child, a living reminder of what had been done to her, and the weight of that secret bent her spirit until it nearly broke. Some said she walked with her head always down, as if ashamed of simply existing. Others noticed how she clutched her belly protectively, not with the joy of a mother, but with the terror of someone carrying evidence of her own undoing. The father, however, showed no such shame. Neighbors whispered that he seemed almost proud, as though the child would be proof that his bloodline could not be diluted, that he had created something the outside world could never touch. His cruelty was not loud, it was quiet, steady, and suffocating. That made it all the more terrifying. The birth was a moment the town could not ignore. For weeks, hushed conversations lingered in kitchens and store aisles. Men shook their heads, women lowered their voices, but still, no one acted. The law never arrived. The church bells never tolled in condemnation. The town turned in on itself, strangled by complicity. They would rather live with a secret than live with the shame of having known and done nothing. The child's fate remains shrouded in uncertainty. Some claim it did not live beyond infancy, its body too weak to carry the burden of its own creation. Others insist the child grew, haunting the family like a walking curse, its face bearing the unmistakable features of both parent and grandparent. Whichever account is true, the story left a wound that never closed. The family name became a ghost, spoken only in warning, never in kindness. For the daughter there was no escape. Trapped within bloodlines that had folded in on themselves for generations, her body became a battlefield she never chose. She bore the punishment for her father's obsession, and when the town looked away, she learned the final lesson of her life, that her pain was never hers to share, only hers to carry. And so the house at the edge of the valley remained, a rotting shell filled with whispers, rumors, and memories too heavy to name. By the time it collapsed, years later, people said they could still hear her voice in the wind, a silence so loud it could break your heart. The further you dig into this story, the harder it becomes to separate fact from folklore. And maybe that's what makes it so haunting. What we know for certain is that there was a man, a daughter, and a child born of their unholy bond. What remains uncertain is how much of the horror was whispered truth and how much was amplified by a community desperate to distance itself from what it allowed to happen. Some records suggest the daughter's child was hidden from the world, kept inside the crumbling house, never permitted to attend school, never seen in the sunlight. Others claim the child grew up sickly and malformed, an echo of the genetic rot that had already been festering in the bloodline for decades. The image of that child, alone, unnamed, existing only in fragments of memory, became the symbol of everything people feared about isolation, secrecy, and sin. What cannot be denied is the silence. It stretched beyond the house, beyond the family, infecting the entire town. Neighbors who might have intervened chose instead to close their curtains tighter. Priests who might have condemned it gave sermons heavy with vagueness, never naming names. Even the law, which should have stepped in, stayed absent. It was as if the valley itself swallowed justice whole, leaving behind nothing but a story that would fester in the dark. And now, as we piece it together, one question keeps returning. What would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have spoken, fled, or would fear and shame have kept you silent like the others? If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The father grew older, but never repentant. He carried his sin like a badge, unmoved by the judgment that lingered in every whispered conversation. The daughter aged too, her life shaped by a wound that never healed. Her voice lost in a silence she was born into and never allowed to escape. And when both were finally gone, the story they left behind became even harder to bury. Because the truth, once it has been stained by blood and secrecy, does not vanish. It lingers, it waits, it haunts. As time passed, the valley changed. Roads were paved, strangers moved in, the old families scattered. Yet even as progress crept in, the story of the father and his daughter lingered like a stain no amount of paint could cover. The younger generations heard it in fragments, half warnings, half nightmares told around kitchen tables or whispered in the dark. Parents would say, "Don't go near that house," or "Never trust a man too obsessed with his own family name." It was less a story and more a curse, passed down like a family heirloom nobody wanted. Those who dared to revisit the ruins of the house spoke of a presence that never left. Collapsed beams, mold-covered walls, windows shattered into black eyes. Yet there was something heavier than the decay of wood and stone. Some described the feeling as suffocation, as if the silence itself pressed against your lungs. Others swore they could still hear faint sounds, the echo of a girl's sobs, or the soft cry of a child who never should have been born. Rational minds dismiss such tales as folklore, but the people who walked through those ruins never forgot what they felt. What makes this story different from other family tragedies is the depth of its betrayal. Fathers are supposed to protect daughters, to shield them from the cruelties of the world. Here, the father was the cruelty, the danger, the monster in the shadows. His daughter's life was stolen not by strangers, but by the very blood that was supposed to keep her safe. That violation twists the knife in a way few other stories can. And yet, the town's silence is just as monstrous, because while the father committed the crime, it was the community that allowed it to thrive. 100 eyes looked away, 100 mouths stayed shut, and in doing so they became accomplices to a horror that still reverberates through memory. In the end, the father died as he lived, When you step back and look at the whole picture, the story of the most inbred father alive is not just about one man, one daughter, or even one family. It is about what happens when silence is allowed to grow stronger than truth. It is about the way shame can chain entire communities, forcing them to turn their faces away from horrors that should never have been ignored. And it is about the scars of secrecy, scars that do not fade, even when generations pass. The house where it all happened is gone now, swallowed by weeds and time. But in the valley, the air still carries it. Old-timers drop their voices when asked about it. Younger people roll their eyes, claiming it's just a ghost story. But deep down, they all know it was real. Too many details survive for it to be dismissed. Too many lives were bent and broken by the weight of a truth no one dared to speak. And so the story lives on, not in newspapers or history books, but in the whispers of those who remember. A father who crossed the line of nature itself, a daughter trapped in a prison built from blood, a child born of both parent and grandparent, carrying a burden that could never be escaped. This is not just a tragedy, it is a reminder that the monsters we fear are not always strangers lurking in the night. Sometimes they are within our own homes, sometimes they wear the face of family. If you have stayed with this story until the very end, you know the truth. Some histories are buried for a reason. They are too raw, too unsettling, too grotesque to be laid bare in the light. And yet, by uncovering them, by remembering them, we prevent them from happening again. Silence may protect the guilty, but truth, haunting as it may be, is the only thing that frees the innocent. So the next time you pass through a forgotten town or see a house sagging into the earth, ask yourself what secrets might be buried there. But because in places where silence reigns, history does not die. It waits, it festers, it whispers, and if you listen closely enough, you may hear it calling your name.